Well, hello, everyone. This is Chris Conklin with Miller Newberg Consulting Actuaries. I want to thank you for joining me today. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding your income statement. At Miller Newberg, we work with a lot of small and mid-sized companies where their statutory income statement is their income statement. Now, we know there are many other companies that use GAAP and some other measures, but today we're really talking about the statutory income statement, which every insurance company, every fraternal benefit society has. And for many of our clients, it's the only income statement that they have. And we find that many of our client companies and many companies in our market are flourishing, but we also see that there are quite a few that have been suffering from diminished profitability in recent years. In fact, they may have even become unprofitable in recent years. And what's interesting is we find in many cases, the management team really isn't clear why. And the reason they're not clear why is because the statutory income statement, as you'll see, really tends to obscure what the story is. And so today we're going to show you how we at Miller Newberg look at an income statement. And we can find that with many small insurance companies, fraternal benefit societies, if you give us a few years of your income statement, we can tell you the story of what's actually happening with your company and why, for example, your profitability is less this year than it has been in prior years. And so our agenda today in this webinar is simply to show you how we look at your income statement and what we see, how we make it so it's all very clear. By the way, as we're going through the content today, if you have any questions or concerns, please submit your question via the chat feature, and I will either get to it by the end of the webinar or we'll send you a personalized response sometime later. So what I'm going to show you is an income statement of an insurance business. Now, this is a fictional income statement, but it's very common. Of what I see. It shows a number of different characteristics that we see again and again as we look at one company after another. Now, this particular company used to be profitable, and over the course of the 7 years has become unprofitable. And the question is, what happened? Why did it go from profitable to unprofitable? So if you look at this income statement, it's presented, we have lines 1 through 14. It's presented in the same order that the summary of operations is presented in the statutory blue book. We'll start with the top section. Revenue starts with premiums. You'll notice for this company, their revenue grew over the 7-year period, and that's of course very common. The next section, a variety of different benefits, both cash benefits as well as increase in reserves, and that also is a number that over the 7-year period rose. Then finally, commissions, general expenses, taxes, license fees, those expenses also rose. We typically see that. Let's skip down to the bottom line, average assets. And this is an enterprise that was growing its asset base, which is great. So everything was going up, which is what we commonly see, but net income went from positive to negative. And again, we asked the question that we posed earlier, which is it obvious just by looking at these numbers why the net income went from positive to negative? And of course, the answer is no, it's really not obvious. So today, I'm going to show you a technique that will allow you to better understand your income statement so that these numbers make a lot more sense. And so it does become obvious why this enterprise went from a positive net income to a negative net income. And then after I show you that technique, I'm going to give you some competitive benchmarking figures against which you can evaluate your company's performance. So once you know your numbers, then you have an idea as to, okay, are we doing better or worse than we should be relative to what we can learn from other insurance companies? So topic number 1 is a technique to better understand your income statement. And this technique, really is inspired by Warren Buffett. So there is a quote, he's very famous for this. I took this particular quote from his February 2010 Berkshire Hathaway shareholder letter, but he has said something like this in a number of different venues. And he talks about what the insurance business is. He says, insurers receive premiums up front and pay claims later. Payments can stretch over decades. And this is true, by the way, for annuities and for life insurance, as well as property casualty insurance. So this collect now, pay later model leaves us holding large sums, money we call float, that will eventually go to others. Meanwhile, we get to invest this float for the company's benefit. Now, you may say, I've never really heard this term float, or I've never heard anybody but Warren Buffett say it. But when he's talking about float, he's talking about reserves. So when you look on your balance sheet and you see reserves, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about money that we have received from customers as premiums that we're going to pay later as claims. So the real insight that he's giving us here is that the very first item on the income statement, premiums, isn't really revenue. What they are, what premiums are, is money that our customers are giving to us for a period of time that we're ultimately going to pay back to them with interest. Now, I think this is pretty obvious with annuities. If somebody gives you $100,000 to put into an annuity, yes, it appears on your income statement as revenue, but I think you know that it's not really revenue. It's $100,000 that your customer is giving you to hang on to for a period of years that ultimately you're going to pay back to that customer with interest. And so premiums are not really revenue. Well, you may say, well, what about life insurance? Aren't premiums revenue on life insurance? And the answer actually is no. It's not quite as one-to-one with life insurance as it is with annuities. If somebody gives you $100,000 in annuity premium, you're going to give them back ultimately their $100,000 plus interest. When it comes to life insurance, it's more collective. You're going to collect premiums from, say, 1,000 people. And ultimately, you're going to pay back those premiums with interest to that group of 1,000 people. You're going to pay, some people are going to get a whole lot more than they paid in, because they died. Their beneficiaries get a much larger sum. Some people will get a portion of what they paid in, or maybe more than they paid in, as cash value. But collectively, it's true with life insurance as it is with annuities. All those premiums that you receive are simply money you're going to get to hang on to for a while that you're going to pay back to your customers with interest. So if premiums aren't revenue, what is revenue? Well, the answer is, as he said here, it's investment income. So what really is your revenue in the insurance business is investment income. So, the big insight that he's giving us here is, if you thought that your profit equation is premiums received less benefits paid and expenses, that's not really your profit equation. What your real profit equation is recognize that all this money you have that was given to you by customers, it's money you're going to pay back with interest. So your real profit equation is interest earned minus interest credited and expenses. Now, I think this is certainly the way you think of it with the annuity business. You recognize that you need to earn more interest than you credit, and that spread between the two needs to cover your expenses. But it really is exactly the same way with life insurance. So again, when it comes to pricing annuities, you'll often think, okay, well, I'm earning 4.46% on my assets, and I'm crediting 3.03% on my liabilities. So that's a spread between the two of 143 basis points. That needs to cover commissions and expenses, and there needs to be some left over for the bottom line. That's the way you think of it with annuities. The fact is, now that you understand that life insurance is really the same way, you can think about your entire income statement that same way. And once you realize that you can think of your entire income statement that same way, it all of a sudden becomes a lot easier to understand. Let me show you two ways of describing that income statement that I just showed you. So I showed you 7 years, and these two bubbles are two ways that the chief financial officer could be explaining the most recent year. So this person could be saying, well, going down each line of the income statement, we brought in $25.7 million of premium, we had $6.5 million of investment income, and $500,000 of IMR amortization. So we say what our revenue is, and we go through each of those items. And then when in the end we say, hey, the net result is a $600,000 loss. And, I've seen CFOs go through financial statements like this with management teams and boards of directors. And, everybody sits around, sort of nodding their head and saying, and all that stuff. But frankly, nobody understands really what it means or what's causing it, what's causing that loss. So let's go to the right-hand bubble. Now, by the way, I'm talking about the exact same set of numbers here, the exact same income statement, but I'm describing it in the new way, the way that I'm showing you here today. And what we're going to say is, look, we earned 446 in our investments. We credited interest of 303. So we had 143 basis points of gross spread to cover commissions and expenses. Now, it turns out we paid 49 basis points in commissions. We had 133 basis points of expenses. That adds up to more than 143 basis points. So the net result is a loss of 39 basis points. So as you can see, the right-hand bubble is just a much more intuitive, understandable way of figuring out what this income statement is telling us. So if we look at our income statement and we see that our 7 years of income statement, which way is it set up? And clearly it was set up as the left-hand bubble, the one that gives you a lot of numbers, but doesn't really help you understand what's going on. The question is, can we translate all of these numbers to the other way? And the answer is absolutely yes. That's what I'm about to show you. So notice on the left-hand side, we have each of these lines numbered 1 through 14, and that is the order that these items appear in the statutory income statement. You're going to notice what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange these things. I'm going to regroup them into a way that makes a lot more sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to rearrange the income statement to reveal the easier view of profitability. And then we're going to divide everything by the asset base so that it looks like an interest rate. And once everything is rearranged and then divided by average assets to look like an interest rate, all of a sudden it's going to make a whole lot of sense, because you're going to see that our revenue item is investment income. And what that needs to cover is net benefits, commissions, operating expenses, and there needs to be some money left over for net income as the bottom line. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So on this next slide, first we rearrange things. Okay, so as I mentioned, the real income figure is investment income. And there are 3 lines that appear on the income statement as investment income. There's net investment income, there's amortization of IMR, and there's net realized capital gains and losses. Just take those 3 lines, really all collectively, they are investment income. Next section is net benefits. And this again comes out of this whole insight that when customers are giving you premiums, it's not really revenue. It's just money that ultimately is going to go back to them as cash benefits. So really, when you take cash benefits and net out premiums, you're pretty much there in terms of net benefits. So what we've done here is we've taken the cash benefit line. So death benefits, maturity endowments, annuity benefits, surrender benefits, interest on deposits. All right, we add those all in. We also add in the increase in reserves, and then we offset against that premiums and any miscellaneous income. That results in net benefits, which is our first cost, our biggest cost. Okay. Then we have 2 other costs. One is commissions, and commissions, thankfully, is the one item that just has a line all in and of itself. And then finally, operating expenses, which is the combination of 2 lines, general expenses and taxes, licenses, fees. So now all we've done is we've taken those 14 lines that appeared on that income statement that I showed you a couple of slides ago, and we simply rearranged them into 4 groups, which are investment income as the positive, and then the costs being net benefits, commissions, operating expenses. So you notice at the bottom of the slide here, we have the average assets each year. It's simply the average of what was the company's beginning of year and end of year assets. So that's average assets. We're going to take these 4 numbers, the ones in bold, investment income, net benefits, commissions, operating expenses, and finally net income. And we're going to divide them by the average assets. And what that's going to do is it's going to express everything as an interest rate. And once it's all expressed as an interest rate, all of a sudden it's going to make sense. So this is the exact same income statement I showed you earlier, just everything regrouped and divided by the average assets. And now, can we see, is it obvious why this enterprise went from profitable to unprofitable? Well, let's go line by line. Start with investment income. 2016, this company had an average rate of investment income of 5.43%. By 2022, you notice it had gone down by about 100 basis points. And again, this is very common. We see this from one company after another. Interest rate environment, until very recently, had been getting lower and had been going down for 40 years. So as a result, really every insurance company has seen their rate of investment income decline over time. The next line is net benefits. Think of this as sort of like an interest rate that you're crediting on annuities. And we see that the rate of net benefits for this company was, it kind of gyrated around a little bit, always does, but was in the neighborhood consistently of 3%. And that's what we also see very consistently from a lot of insurance companies, is that their cost of benefits tends to stay steady over time. So as much as investment income went down over the course of the 7-year period, the cost of benefits stayed pretty steady. Again, we see this a lot. Okay, the next line being commissions. Commissions here, we can see for this enterprise stayed pretty steady at about 50 basis points. And 50 basis points is a good level of commission expense, because what that means is if you're spending that much on commissions, it means you're bringing in enough business to grow your asset base. And so this company did grow its asset base, and that's good. Lots of times we see companies, if they're shrinking their asset base, their commissions are lower. So, having a low number on commissions isn't necessarily a good thing. You want a high enough number that you're growing your asset base. And then finally, operating expenses. You can see in 2016, 110 basis points in operating expenses. It kind of stayed in that 110 basis point area for a while, and then notice it started drifting upwards. And finally, by 2022, it was 133 basis points. Now, what does this mean? Well, remember, this is simply expenses divided by your asset base. And so if this ratio is going up, it means that this company's expenses were growing faster than its asset base. And that's bad, okay, because that drives down net income. It tells you, we'll talk about this more later, but it tells you if you're running an insurance company, how much can you afford to have your expenses go up each year? Well, they have to go up by no more as a percentage, no more than the percent that your asset base went up. So if your asset base grew by 2%, you can really only afford to have your operating expenses grow by 2%. And that's just to keep your expense ratio steady. Competitive pressures are actually forcing you to take your expense ratio down over time. All right, so we began 2016 with investment income about 100 basis points higher than it was 7 years later. At the same time, in 2016, the expense ratio was 23 basis points lower than it was by 2022. That right there explains why this company was profitable in 2016 to the tune of 63 basis points, which is a good, healthy level of profit. Why by 2022 it had gone negative. Over the 7-year period, their investment income was steadily going down. Their operating expenses were steadily going up. Net benefits and commissions were holding steady. That's the recipe that takes you from positive net income to negative. And so that gives you the roadmap of how do you get back where you need to be. You figure out, okay, going forward, so let's start with operating expenses. Going forward, how do I keep my operating expenses from going up while at the same time growing my asset base? And that will shrink your expense ratio back down. With investment income, you start to think about, okay, how can I get my investment income back up? A lot of insurance companies, especially smaller insurance companies, tend to think of investment income as just sort of the icing on the cake. But hopefully you'll see, not just so far, but I'll go into it more in a second. Investment income isn't just the icing on the cake. It is really the one revenue item you have, and it needs to cover your cost of interest crediting or whatever your growth and benefits. It needs to cover your commissions, your expenses. It needs to provide net income. So investment income is crucially important. It's not just the icing on the cake. All right, let's give you some competitive benchmarking figures. So once you know your numbers, then the question is, are your numbers good or are they bad compared to what we see out there in the marketplace? So what I'm about to show you is a bunch of competitive benchmarking, numbers, statements, things like that. And these things assume that most of your policyholder liabilities are annuities and cash value life insurance. Now, if it turns out you're a company where the vast majority of what you do is, for example, term life insurance or health insurance, then we would tend to look at a different set of ratios for you. Okay. But most of the folks on this call, you're in the annuity business, you're in the cash value life insurance business. These are asset intensive businesses. And so what I'm about to show you is exactly the way we look at your business and the way we benchmark you relative to some competition. Before I get into it, let me spend a little bit more time on the importance of investment income and the value of having a higher than average investment yield. If you happen to be an insurance company that has a higher than average investment yield, that creates a virtuous cycle for you. So we're going to start at the 12 o'clock position with the higher than average investment yield. And we're going to go around clockwise. If you have a higher than average investment yield, then you can afford to provide your customers with higher credited rates and higher dividend scales. And if you can provide your clients with higher credit rates and higher dividend scales, then guess what? It makes it easier to attract money, to retain money, and therefore grow your asset base. And if your asset base is growing rapidly, then it's not hard for you to grow your asset base at a faster percentage than your expenses. And if you're growing your asset base at a faster percentage of your expenses, that's lowering your expense ratio, which is good because lowering your expense ratio gives you higher profitability. As you have higher profitability, you have the ability to do more complex things, including, for example, having a more aggressive investment strategy, which then reinforces your higher than average investment yield. So you can see that a higher than average investment yield gets you on a virtuous cycle. Now, if you happen to have a lower than average investment yield, it gets you on what we call the vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle is really just the opposite effect of what we just talked about. If you have a lower than average investment yield, then that really forces you can only afford a lower than average credited rate or lower than average dividend scale for your customers. And if you have lower than average credited rates, lower than average dividend scales, then it makes it harder for you to attract money, harder for you to retain money, harder for you to grow your asset base. And if that's the case, then chances are your expenses are growing at a faster percentage than your asset base, which is raising your expense ratio, which is then hurting your profitability. And when your profitability is hurting, it really limits your ability to do more complex things, such as take on more investment risk, which reinforces your lower than average investment yield. So with a lower than average investment yield, you end up on a vicious cycle. And again, remember, investment income is really your one revenue. When customers give you premiums, they're simply lending you their money for a period of time. You're going to have to pay it back with interest. Your revenue item is your investment yield. So are you experiencing the virtuous cycle or the vicious cycle? Well, taking a look at your, in 2022, your portfolio yield, if it was less than 4.5%, it was certainly a competitive problem. It really had to be in the high fours for you to be on the virtuous side of that cycle. And if you look at new money rates now, of course, interest rates have been going up for the last 2 years. And so we're in a completely different interest rate environment than we were in at the time that you purchased the vast majority of your assets. And so, new money yields, if somebody gives you, $100,000 of annuity premium and you're going to go out there and buy a new investment with that, right now, that new money yield needs to be around 7% in order for you to be competitive. If you're not getting around 7% investment income on new money, then that's a competitive problem for you. Okay, because it means if you're above this, you're on the virtuous cycle. If you're below this, you're on the vicious cycle. And we just talked about how important that is. All right, the next piece is net benefits. Remember, in our theoretical example, we saw a steady rate of net benefits of around 3%. And that's often what we see. We see for a business that is predominantly annuities, their cost of benefits in 2022 was typically in the upper 2% range, close to 3%. And for a business that was predominantly life insurance, they were in the low 2% range. Okay, so everybody was pretty much, in the industry was somewhere in the twos. Life focused business in the low end of that 2% range. Annuity focused business is up in the high 2% range, up here 3%. Now the spread between your net benefits and your investment income needs to be at least 1.5%, and nearer to 2% is definitely better. Okay, so that tells you why if your cost of net benefits is going to be around 3%, that tells you why your portfolio yield had to be 4.5 to 5 for you to be in good shape. Right now, today on annuities, new money credited rates typically are around 5%. So with you needing at least 150 basis points, really 2% spread over that, that tells you why your new money investment rate needs to be around 7 for you to be able to profitably offer a competitive credited rate of 5%. And again, the other thing that we've seen is for most insurance companies, this cost of net benefits has remained very steady over the last decade or so, even though the interest rate environment was certainly headed downward over most of that 10-year period. The cost of benefits had to stay pretty steady. Why is that? Competitive pressure. Competitive pressure simply wasn't allowing you to take down your net benefits, allowing you to take down your credited rates, your dividend scales, nearly as much as your investment income was falling. Agent commissions, we talked about this earlier. A high figure for this is not necessarily a problem, nor is a low figure good. For companies that have a sales volume that's a really healthy sales volume that's allowing them to grow their asset base, we see this figure is often around 50 basis points. And then we see other insurance companies, they're not successfully selling a lot of business. They're not successfully growing their asset base. They'll have a low ratio for asset commissions, well below 50 basis points. That doesn't mean it's good. I tend to view 50 basis points as really a good number because if you're there, chances are you're growing your asset base, and that's good. Operating expenses. Wow. I have seen insurance companies all over the map on this, from as low as 40 basis points to as high as 250 basis points. Small companies typically average around 1% of assets, 100 basis points. There's definitely some variation here if you're talking about a life insurance focused company versus an annuity focused company. Life insurance focused companies tend to be a little higher than this. Annuity focused companies a little bit lower. So if you're really in that annuity focused realm, so we're talking, annuities or perhaps single premium whole life being your top life insurance product, I found that realistically, the market will let you price in about 60 basis points, 60 basis points. If your expense ratio, therefore, is higher than 60 basis points, it's coming right out of your bottom line, because all the market will let you do is 60 basis points. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, we're small. These larger companies have economies of scale. Therefore, we have no chance, right? We can't compete with them. Well, large size usually does help to drive down this ratio. So there are economies of scales for sure. But I have also seen many smaller companies that have achieved competitive expense ratios. And if you're a company that has really a bloated expense structure, if I were to take you in to visit one of these companies, you would be stunned at the amount of business they can process with the small size of staff that they have. So there definitely are efficiencies to be had. And just because you're small doesn't mean you can't have a competitive expense ratio. It's completely possible. Also, competitive pressures are demanding that your expense ratio go down over time. So it's not enough to keep your expenses from growing faster than your asset base. You actually need your expenses to be growing slower than the growth in your asset base. But at the very least, your expenses cannot be growing faster than your asset base. A mistake that a lot of small insurance companies make is they say, well, expenses are going up every year. It's just inflation. It's just the way it is. Or maybe I'm investing for growth. But you know what? If the growth in assets doesn't come, then you couldn't have afforded the expenses that you put into it. Bottom line is your expenses must be growing by a lesser percentage than the growth in your asset base. Otherwise, your expense ratio is going up when the market's demanding that your expense ratio must go down. And then finally, net income. Net income, must be positive. You may say, well, some folks may be saying, well, I'm a fraternal benefit society. Do I really need my net income to be positive? I'm a nonprofit. Well, the answer is your net income must be positive. Why? Because it's the only way you can grow your surplus besides raising outside capital. And that's always painful. So net income must be positive in order to grow your surplus. And in order to maintain a steady risk-based capital ratio, as you grow your annuity and insurance business and you're growing your asset base, you need to be growing your surplus. And the way you grow your surplus is by having positive net income. So positive net income is not optional. It is completely mandatory. Otherwise, your RBC ratios can be falling. We typically find for companies that are doing well, their net income is typically 50 basis points, right? 0.5% of their asset base is often what is falling to their bottom line as net income. And so, we've seen quite a few numbers here that are right around that 50 basis points. We were talked about, for example, commissions being around 50 basis points. We talked about with operating expenses that 60 basis points is really what the annuity and single premium whole life market will let you do, and your bottom line needs to be about 50 basis points. So often you want to think of, okay, what's my gross spread? My gross spread, investment income less net benefits. That needs to be at least 150 basis points, maybe 200 basis points. And really, if you're splitting that about a third each between your agent commissions, your operating expenses, and your bottom line, then you're pretty much where you need to be. All right, so let's recap this competitive benchmarking that I talked about here. All right, so net investment income, what we saw is 450 to 460 is really the competitive norm for 2022's income statement. If you were above that, great. You were on the virtuous cycle. If you were below that, not good. You were on the vicious cycle. Same thing looking at new money. Really, for new money right now, you should be looking at investments 7% or higher being the yield. If you're well below 7% for new money yields, then you're on the vicious cycle, or you will be. For net policyholder benefits, again, for in-force business, that's often in the 3% range for annuities, in the low 2% for a life insurance focused business. Your cost of policyholder benefits for new money, since interest rates are so much higher now, is more in the 5% range, especially for annuities. And then finally, when it comes to agent commissions, expenses, net income, they should all be in the 50 basis point range, maybe a little higher for expenses. And if you're there, then you're doing just fine. Now you may wonder, all right, how do I compare? There's a couple of ways you can get there. First of all, you can use the technique that I showed you here today to put together the numbers for your own business, and then you can do it. Then you can know where your numbers are, and you can have a sense of where you stand and what you need to do. But the other thing is, this is an offer I'm throwing out to everybody who's attending today, is that no charge, no obligation. If you provide us with several years of your income statements, we'll put together the numbers for you. We'll provide you with your numbers, and we'll have a conversation with you about what they mean. This is not hard for us to do. It doesn't take us a whole lot of time, but can actually end up being incredibly valuable for you to understand what's going on with your business and how do we get it to a better place. So why are we doing this? Well, a couple reasons. One, we want your company to be growing profitably. And the other is, we want you to have, if you choose to let us have a conversation with you, we really want to give you, some very good ideas that hopefully you would not have learned elsewhere. And you say, oh, I see the value of continuing to talk with these guys. All right. So if you have any questions, go ahead and submit them via the chat feature. And since we have none at this point, I'm going to close the webinar. But if you have any questions or any concerns, then you have my contact information right there on the screen. You can give me a call, send me an email. We'd be happy to help you. And again, certainly take me up on this offer here. Send me several years of your income statements. I'll put together your numbers. I'll have a conversation with you about what they mean. Absolutely no charge, no obligation. Please take me up on that. So everyone, thank you very much for joining us for the webinar today. And I look forward to talking with many of you soon. Thanks so much.